If you'll come with me, you'll float too.
You'll float too! You'll float too! You'll...
Kicking off at number 5, a cemetery. Yep, you heard that correctly. Now, the trope of a home being built atop a burial ground or a pagan sacrificial site is commonly prevalent in horror literature and cinema, mainly lending itself to the rapid expansion of the modern era and the ignorance of ancient history. In cinema, we've got Pet Sematary, Amityville Horror, and Poltergeist, as well as many more, but as I say time and time again, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. That's exactly what happened in 2003 when Wisconsin woman Helen Wasensow found a child's skull after attempting to repair the foundations of her basement. Initially, she thought it was evidence of an unsolved murder, but when surveyors later found a literal cemetery spanning beneath her basement, things got a little weird. It turned out that the skull belonged to a male that was buried in 1840, and there were countless disturbed graves just sitting and waiting patiently beneath Helen's basement. The good news though is that she'd lived there for 20 years and hadn't yet been possessed by a poltergeist, so she must have been doing something right. Next up at number 4, a nest of snakes. We're going back to the USA again, a small town in Idaho where couple Ben and Amber Sessions had recently purchased what they believed to be their dream home. Yeah, be careful what you wish for. Soon after moving into the house, husband Ben started finding snakes in the yard. At first it was a few, not too big of a deal, right? This is rural Idaho. But then Ben found over 40 snakes slithering in his yard in a single day. He literally had to shovel them out by the bucket load. Then things took a turn for the worst and the couple started hearing rustling in the walls. Mice? No, it was like a slithering sound, a buzzing barrage of slithering movement, kind of like the walls were moving. Well, that's when Ben went down to the basement crawl space the next morning, and after he slid away a panel in the foundation, he stepped back in horror. The walls were filled with snakes. Turns out their dream home was actually built on a terrifyingly gigantic hibernaculum, a literal hive of hundreds of snakes living and breeding and feeding on the house's warmth. In an even sadder turn, they had to abandon the house and file for bankruptcy, not before the estate agents that sold them that house tried to put it back on the market for the next unwitting victim though. Those damn estate agents. Coming in at number 3, Ben Franklin skeletons. Old Benjamin Franklin, the first American and a founding father of the United States, inventor of the bifocals and the Franklin stove. He's got nothing to hide, right? Well, it turns out that he had quite a few skeletons in his closet. Well, basement actually. In 1998, conservationists back in England began making repairs on Franklin's London home, 36 Craven Street, when they stumbled upon a pretty bloody discovery. It turned out in the basement of the house, more than 15 bodies, 6 of which were children, were buried in a secret windowless room. However, although I'm not entirely convinced, it's widely considered that Ben Franklin wasn't harboring evidence of some horrific homicide, but may have actually been covering for his friend William Hewson, Franklin's friend and academic protege that was running an anatomy school at the time. In the 18th century, human dissection for scientific purposes was still ethically frowned upon, and students had to acquire cadavers illegally. This included paying grave robbers to dig up remains of the newly deceased. So Ben Franklin was just being a good friend, right? Either that or he was a sadistic mass murderer. Next up at number 2, mummified children. Yeah, you're going to be seeing a pattern with our next 2 points. Pretty morbid stuff. Back in 2010, 2 women, Gloria Gomez and Yiming Jing, found 3 large trunks in the basement of the once Grand Glen Donald apartment in Los Angeles. After opening them, they found what appeared to be a hoard of antique treasure, a gleaming crystal bowl, stacks of beautiful books including an original copy of Peter Pan, and 2 leather doctor's satchels. Thinking they were worth a hell of a lot of money, they started digging deeper, but when they found a small bundle of newspapers in the satchels, they shrank back in horror at what was wrapped inside them: the mummified remains of 2 babies. It turned out that the trunk was owned by a Scottish-born nurse by the name of Janet Mann Barry, a strange coincidence as the same initials of the author of Peter Pan. The possibility of her being related to the author was explored, but detectives found no such connection. Through DNA evidence, detectives found that the corpses were the children of the nurse, and although the case is closed, the explanation for the baby's death will likely never be discovered. And finally, our number 1 point, a mummified corpse. See? I told you we were sticking to a theme. Imagine exploring your newly purchased house, making your way to the lower levels, and then discovering a literal mummified corpse sat on a chair staring at you. Well, that's exactly what happened to Jorge Giro, who'd purchased a home in the seaside town of Roses, Spain. It turned out that the previous owner had mysteriously disappeared, but that actually meant she'd passed away peacefully, but no one had checked on her. I mean, it's actually insane that no one had checked the house before selling it at auction, and this is where it gets even crazier. No one knows how long the corpse had sat there, but the mortgage payments to the house had ceased 6 years prior. 6 years just sat there mummifying in the salty sea air, serendipitously waiting for Jorge to discover her. Wow, let's hope there were no curses involved, eh? Coming in at number 5, we have a story that found college students Brett Muglin and Mark Hartman questioning whether they would even finish their senior year. In 2013, the pair moved into an absolutely huge student house at Ohio State University. Things were going great until one morning when they woke to find every door in every room wide open. Bedroom doors, the dishwasher, the dryer, the washing machine, even the microwave. Talking to their college newspaper, they said, "We've been telling everybody the story of the ghosts in our house coming and opening all our cupboards, the microwave and oven, and all this stuff. We weren't really sure how to explain it." Things got even weirder when they would start to hear strange noises like dings and alarms late at night. They thought it was coming from downstairs, so they decided to investigate. Brett and Mark scoured the house but didn't find anything until they reached the basement, where they discovered a locked door that no one had a key to. Sounds? They were coming from inside. The noises and strange occurrences continued for weeks, until Brett had a weird encounter. He was fixing the power downstairs when he came across a man they had never seen before. Without skipping a beat, the man told Brett, "I was wondering when I would get to meet the people who live here." He introduced himself as Jeremy. Later that day, when Brett and Mark were hanging out with the house's downstairs lodgers, Brett made a comment that he'd met their roommate Jeremy recently, to which they all replied, "We don't have a roommate named Jeremy." In fact, no one had even heard of a man named Jeremy. So, of course, they called the landlord, who then called the police, who then pried off the mystery basement door and inside found a livable bedroom with photos, a TV, and a wardrobe full of clothes. There were even family pictures on the walls, to which Brett later identified the man that he'd met. I told you guys, lock your doors. Next up at number 4 is something pretty different. In August of 2010, amateur antique collector Gloria Gomez was keen to explore the basement of an abandoned Los Angeles apartment building. She had caught word of 3 large trunks that had been left behind from the 1930s and was eagerly hoping to find some treasure. Unluckily for Gloria, the first 2 trunks were empty, but as she broke the lock on the 3rd, she was astounded by what she had found. A gleaming crystal bowl, stacks of beautiful books, and an incredibly rare copy of Peter Pan. There were also 2 leather doctor's satchels, which Gloria had hoped would be worth a pretty hefty sum. While inside those bags were small bundles of LA Times newspapers from the 1930s. But what she found wrapped up in the print made her shrink back in horror. The bundles contained the mummified remains of 2 babies. Initially, not knowing if they were human, she feared that she had disturbed their spirits. Her friend had asked if they should bury them, but Gloria was adamant that they call the police. Police investigators estimated that the babies had passed away up to 8 decades ago. But as to how they had died, or why they were even there, remains a mystery to this day. Bringing it in at number 3, we've got another golden oldie with the bizarre story of Theodore Edward Conis. In September 1941, America was still in the grip of the Great Depression, and Theodore Edward Conis had fallen on hard times. He decided to visit his old friend Philip Peters in the hope that his fortune would take a turn for the better. When he arrived at Philip's place in Denver, Colorado, no one was home. Philip was out to see his wife in the hospital, who was out with a broken hip. So, ever the opportunist, Theodore let himself in. Now, Teddy was a pretty small man, and he had managed to slip through a tiny door that led to a cozy little room inside the house. Facing a harsh winter, he figured it was probably best just to stay put. Now, this is where things get a little bit out of hand. Instead of just coming clean and letting Philip know that he'd snuck in while he was out, Theodore remained hidden and lived in the tiny room for weeks. Whenever Philip would leave his house, he'd sneak out, help himself to food, and use the bathroom. This lasted until October 17th, an entire month's worth of hide and seek. On that day, Teddy did his usual routine and slipped out of his hiding hole to cook some lunch. Except Philip hadn't gone out this time. He was actually napping and was terrified by the man walking around his house. Theodore attacked Peters, brutally pistol whipping the 73-year-old man to death. Instead of fleeing the scene, Teddy had gotten used to his hiding spot and returned there after the crime. Police were called after Philip's friends hadn't heard from him in a while and discovered his body while checking the house. The investigators were completely perplexed by the crime and left the case cold. Philip's wife hired housekeepers shortly after his death, but they all quickly left, convinced that the house was haunted. Teddy remained in the house for an insane 11 months until he was caught. It was only until a stubborn police surveillance officer saw him twitch a curtain. He was chased through the house back to the tiny hole that he'd been hiding in. Crazy. Now, at number 2, we're going back to the basement in Beijing. In 2017, a Chinese state report highlighted the existence of an entire underground city of workers right underneath a luxury Beijing apartment complex. Homeowners of the Zhulong Gardens residence first became suspicious when they'd started to notice more and more unfamiliar faces in the apartment's lobby. After notifying officials, an investigation led to the discovery of a warren of hidden rooms starting at the building's basement. The underground space had been subdivided into separate workers' dorms, kitchens, and even a smoking room. The space was incredibly cramped and a stark contrast to the luxurious Zhulong Gardens above. The inhabitants of the warren were migrant workers who had risked an unsafe living environment just to earn a wage. Sadly enough, similar stories have been increasingly common, with Beijing reported to have the least affordable rental housing in the world. Finally, coming in at number 1, we have the story of Davis Wallman, an employee of Seattle's Como News. Well, he heard rustling in the upper levels of his Washington home. When he tried the door, he found it locked, which was odd considering that it was, his house. In the unusual position of knocking on a door in his own home, it took a while before he heard a voice reply, "Jimmy, is that you, Jimmy?" He heard more rustling as well as odd noises making their way closer and closer to him. Before he knew it, the door had swung open and Davis was confronted by the face of a strange, dark-haired woman, a complete stranger in his own home. Davis asked the woman who the heck she was and why she was in his house, but the woman insisted, "This is my house. I live here. Jimmy said I could live here." While sneakily calling 911, Davis tried to keep the woman distracted until police could arrive. Unfortunately, they took almost 20 minutes to get there, and the strange, dark-haired woman had disappeared. Davis says he has no idea how the woman had entered his house. Nothing was stolen, and there was very little out of place. Police are still investigating the case, and Davis has since changed all of the locks on his doors. Good job, Davis.
Coming in at number 5, duffel bag. One of the many stories hailing from Reddit, this user tells of the time they were sharing a house with some friends, and on one particular night they decided to explore the basement. As you do, considering they hadn't been down there since they had moved in. The user describes a small dirt crawl space in the basement, so one of the men decided to grab a flashlight and check it out. However, soon after the man yelled out after discovering something quite concerning. He emerged carrying a duffel bag, which contained items that would send chills down most sane people's spines. But not mine, never mind, I don't understand the concept of fear. It's called being a sociopath. Anyway, the bag contained a hunting knife, 2 black ski masks, and 1 single black leather glove. Very O.J. Simpson. The group called the police immediately, but for some strange reason they couldn't do anything with the evidence, so the group decided to burn everything except for the hunting knife, which the user states that he still possesses. If it were me, I would have burned that as well. You never know who may return one day looking for that knife. Coming in at number 4, pet gator. A Michigan reptile expert has some advice for you animal lovers out there. Do not get a pet alligator. Period. Because it will get bigger, and when it does, it will bite you and try to eat you. According to reports, a man in Michigan owned an illegal pet alligator which he kept in the basement of his home. Yes, you heard me correctly, the basement of his home. The gator was apparently kept in a cage away from the outside world and even far away from light, where still the man stated that he would often let the gator out into the backyard to play, I guess? I don't know. Thankfully though, the gator was taken off his hands when a mechanic who was fixing something in the basement took pictures of the illegal pet and called animal control. The gator was thus released back into the wild, with the man being charged for owning an illegal pet. However, this wasn't the only case of a person owning a gator, which is baffling to me. According to reports, pet gators are on the rise in Michigan specifically, with at least 6 of the scaly creatures being spotted on the loose, popping up in lakes, parks, and backyards. On one occasion, a man was seen lassoing the neighbor's pet gator when they found it tromping across their yard after it made an escape. The owner of the gator, named Puff, took it back home before stating, "It's hard for people to understand. People judging me don't know about alligators. They make good pets." Sure, Jan. Coming in at number 3, secret bunker. So this point should be prefaced by saying, whenever a homeowner passes away, real estate agents sell the house as is, with all the contents still inside. for the most part, which to me is absolutely horrific. And on one particular occasion, this happened. However, the new homeowner was thrilled to receive some new goods and furniture and headed to the basement to survey the rest of his loot. However, when he got to the bottom of the stairs, he found an odd sheet of plywood attached to the wall. He went to remove it, but discovered something truly harrowing: an entrance to a secret room. The room was just 4 by 4 feet, but it was filled with the unthinkable. It contained several gun cases and manuals, a giant safe, an assortment of ammo, and a hollowed out grenade. The man also discovered a chest containing money, but sadly it was just pennies, but beggars can't be choosers. Now, whether it was a doomsday bunker or something much darker, we will never know. But what do you guys think? Coming in at number 2, A Stranger. Now, this one is just downright terrifying. One ordinary day, a group of college students who had been living in the house for some time discovered something oddly suspicious. The group discovered a secret room that was quite clearly being lived in. Now, the entire house was being shared by 15 people, so it was difficult to keep up with everyone in the house, with most of the boys just assuming that the locked basement room was a maintenance closet that the landlord wanted to keep closed. However, when maintenance workers knocked on the door down there, they discovered a bedroom complete with framed photographs and textbooks. Creepier still, during the summer, one of the students walked into the basement and encountered a man who said he had wondered when he was going to meet the new residents of the house. What? And when asked if he lived on the first floor, the man skirted around the question. The group of students had the locks changed that night and posted a note asking their uninvited house guest to call them, which surprisingly he did. A man named Jeremy ended up contacting the students before moving his belongings out of the room. It actually turned out that Jeremy's cousin had lived in the house the year prior, which is how he got in, according to the housemates. The locks had never been changed. Rookie mistake. Talk about a dangerous situation. Thankfully, it wasn't a lot worse.
I'd been telling everybody the story about the ghost in our house, coming and opening all our cupboards and the oven and the microwave and all this stuff.
And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Doll Family. In my opinion, there is nothing creepier than a doll. Actually, sorry, I'm wrong. There is nothing creepier than a cluster of dolls. That's right, cluster. Let's say a family of dolls living beneath your house without you ever knowing. Yeah, sounds terrifying, right? Well, one Reddit user stumbled across one thing no one would ever want to see: a family of dolls in a basement, seemingly behind bars. A restaurant in Phoenix was home to this horrific basement scene, with the person who discovered it descending down a long spiral staircase that led directly to the basement. And of course, he would regret his decision immediately. The image itself shows a line of dolls sitting along a wall at a makeshift table, as if they were about to eat dinner. However, upon further observation, you can clearly see that it is less of a dinner and more of a Last Supper, with the doll in the middle looking strangely human and clearly depicting Jesus. It doesn't stop there though. There are also coins spread out across the table, with the scene surely haunting the man to this day. However, like all terrifying things, this was not the only encounter with creepy dolls. This old lady doll was discovered in the basement of an estate sale. It's incredibly frightening to look at, and worse still, the doll has the body of an old woman, something you typically don't see on any doll ever. Not to mention the expression on the doll's face is one of anguish, preventing you from looking at the picture for longer than a couple of seconds. Unless you're me, I stared at it for hours. I'm still looking at it now. The Reddit user who discovered the doll stated that there was a name carved into the back of the doll's neck, suggesting it was the previous owner. Worse still, the doll was discovered in a black box, tightly secured, suggesting someone didn't want it to be opened.